especially in coastal, San Diego. And oh, I see Nan is coming. And yeah, and finally, the third activity, the third section will be about, so we're going to start with a map that documents, visualize the burden of extreme heat zip code by zip code in San Diego. And I will ask you, and we'll have a discussion about why do we see so much spatial discrepancy between zip codes in San Diego, just like why there are some zip codes in which the burden of extreme heat is higher, which means that people that are going to be hospitalized because of extreme heat is higher, and other zip code in which this estimates this number of people being impacted by heat is low. So we will have, just like that will be like an investigation to try to understand what is happening and why we see this discrepancy. So that's the menu for today. So I think I suggest, unless you have any question, and I just want to make sure that I can see the chat. Yep, I can. Yeah, so unless you have any question, I think we can start with the first activity. If that's okay. So again, this is an experiment. So if you want to do it differently, just don't hesitate. We are a very small group, so we have a lot of flexibility. So I suggest we start by this first question. So when we think about the burden attributable to extreme heat, when you look at the estimates from the CDC in the US, the CDC estimates that on average, we have between 600 and 700 people that are dying directly due to heat in the US every year. So this is 600 to 700. There is a little bit of variation year to year, but this is like more or less this order of magnitude. But then when we conduct more sophisticated epidemiological analysis, as we do, for example, and this is what I will present you in a few slides, when we try to calculate the total burden of extreme heat in the US, this estimate goes between 12 to 20,000 people every year in the US. So there is a big difference between these two numbers, what the CDC estimates and what we actually calculate when we try to calculate the burden attributable to extreme heat in the US. So on the same years, so there is a big discrepancy, like an order of magnitude of 2 at least. So my first question for you, and this is just a way to warm up. So what do you think is driving this discrepancy between the CDC numbers and the numbers that we are estimating epidemiologically? And both numbers are correct, they just don't represent the same thing. So there is a reason for which we have these two very, very different numbers. And I wonder if you have any ideas about why we see such differences. And we can, if you have any ideas. If you don't, that's okay. This is why we have this presentation, but I just wonder what will be your kind of initial thought and intuition about this huge discrepancy.
See, Gina has her hand up. Gina?
Oh. So, I mean, just like a lot of other factors that impact health, it's really hard to attribute a lot of chronic illnesses and death directly to heat. So I think just because it exacerbates other problems that people might have, whether it be respiratory illnesses or other chronic conditions, even cardiovascular conditions. So it's really difficult, right? So I think that's where the discrepancy lies.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Because so what you said is totally correct, that it's important to distinguish what heat is going to do directly, and we're going to talk about that, from what heat is going to just like do indirectly and exacerbate existing comorbidities, existing issues. And you will see that a lot, and I will go through all of that. And the main driver of these differences is really that 658, or it varies, but on average it's 658. This is only heat-related deaths. So people that were, like when they went to the hospital, for example, where just like the physician or the coroner identified this specific case of death as with a specific code. I don't know if you're familiar with how it works when you have a hospital admission or an emergency department visit, but there is a classification of diseases. We call that ICD, International Classification of Disease. So now we have the number 10 of this classification, and you have all of the potential diseases that are ranked according to different codes. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but when you go to the hospital, technically your physician or your nurse is going to list like different types of ICD codes. So there is one that is specific to heat-related illnesses. In the last classification, this is number 992, and this number 658 is a number of people that died prematurely and were classified as this with these specific ICD codes. But you can see that this is like just like the minority of the total burden attributable to heat, because most of the burden attributable to heat is caused by an exacerbation of existing comorbidities, and this is what we're going to talk about. So
Tarik, we also have a comment in the chat as well.
Sorry.
Which is Guadalupe said maybe deaths are not recorded in low-income areas and or complications with other illnesses.
Yeah, so deaths in the US, at least, I think they are like pretty consistently recorded and reported. So this is, I don't think that there is no like underestimation in the number of deaths, but, and this is a major key issue, someone that will die because of extreme heat, which means that without like the heat wave event, this individual would not have died, but someone is going to die and will be classified because of maybe like an acute renal failure, or maybe will be classified because of a respiratory complication or asthma exacerbation or like a cardiac arrest or maybe a stroke. And I will explain later in a few slides why heat is leading to all of these complications. But this is really what is going to happen. So, and what we're going to see happening is many people showing up because of a stroke, because of like myocardial infarction, because of asthma exacerbation, because of COPD complications, etc. So this is what will be listed. But it will be very hard for the physician to attribute this specific death to a heat wave. So this is why we need to do what we do, like to do like very complex epidemiological analysis to try to disentangle that. But this discrepancy is really coming from how deaths are classified, and because heat is so sneaky and going to impact many different physiological pathway, and this is what we're going to talk about. So that's just like a way to introduce this topic. And also the reason for which I usually start this just like talking about heat with these big numbers and these big discrepancies, also to show how heat is underappreciated environmental hazards. This is by far, like beyond wildfire smoke, beyond hurricanes, beyond dust storms, beyond anything you can think about that is related to climate change, the most important killer. And that's the case in the US, but that's the case globally. This is a huge deal, but this is so indirect and so sneaky. People don't recognize how big deal extreme heat is. And of course, and this is something we're going to talk about later, this is not random issue. This is not everyone has the same chance of being impacted by heat. There is a lot of inequalities associated with extreme heat, and we're going to talk about that in a few slides. So that was just like the first part, but this is how I wanted to introduce just like all of the physiological mechanisms that we're going to talk about, just to explain why heat is mostly impacting populations through indirect impacts and exacerbation of different existing comorbidities. And you can see where I'm going, because people that have existing comorbidities, it's not a random process. People that don't like, depending on the type of occupation, the access to healthcare, at least in the US, etc., you can see that the distribution of existing comorbidities is everything but random. We're going to go back to that at the end. We're going to talk about what's happening in San Diego, but this is really like just a way to introduce the fact that heat is a huge environmental justice issue because of this exacerbation of existing comorbidities. So that being said, do you have any question or any comment or anything before I start talking about the physiological processes and like being a little bit more jargony? Are you good? I think I can see everybody on my screen now. Okay. Okay, so let's start. So first, just talking about what we talk about when we talk about the direct impact of heat, and what typically is going to be classified as ICD code 992, a direct death directly attributable to extreme heat, which will typically be a heat stroke. So that is very special. So, but usually we have like a kind of a cascade of events that will lead to a heat stroke. So we had like the heat cramps, then it lead to a heat exhaustion. I'm pretty sure most of you already experienced the heat exhaustion. You go for a hike, you don't, or you're a little bit more super optimistic about your shape, like physical shape. You don't drink enough water. If you feel dizzy, if you have some cramps, this is a heat exhaustion. This is like very likely. So that is relatively mild, and we can, by going to a cool place after a few hours, if you don't have any severe comorbidity, you will be perfectly fine and you will go back to a normal kind of situation again. Just need to drink enough water, go to a cool place, and your body will recover. But this is if you are like you don't have any very severe comorbidity. But if you don't drink water, or if you stay in this like extreme heat temperature, it may lead to a heat stroke that can be deadly. And so usually when people are going to die prematurely through a heat stroke because of heat, and will be classified like that, because again, here I'm talking, there is like a lot of physiological things that happen when exposed to heat, and we're going to talk about that. But what I'm talking about right now is about how a specific case of death showing up to the hospital, or someone that is found at home, for example. So why some cases are going to be classified as 992 and others not. And most of the time, people that will be classified in this 658 deaths directly attributable to heat will be very, very specific situations. So it will be people that will be found at home dying because of a heat wave, but the body temperature will be extremely high. So it will be unambiguous that this death is attributable to heat, because the body temperature will be more like maybe like 100 Fahrenheit or 110 Fahrenheit. So there will be no ambiguity. So in this case, it will be very easy to classify this case of death as 992. It could be like a hiker that will be found death, and which is a very high body temperature. That can also happen. And most of the cases are actually occupational situation and outdoor workers that may be exposed to very high temperatures, and actually it can affect any age groups. So this is why like heat is not just going to impact people above 75 or so. This is like affecting a lot of individuals. So this is just like everything I'm talking about right now. It's really what we are referring to as direct impact of extreme heat. So this is what will be classified in this kind of relatively low number. Okay, but now I would like to talk about why we can look at the total burden, the true burden of heat that includes the indirect impacts that will exacerbate existing comorbidities, can go up to 12 to 20,000 people in the US every year. So to do that, I would like just to explain just like the physiological mechanisms. And again, if you have any questions about the biology, the physiology, about what's happening, we are here to discuss that. And but just like in general, just like one thing to introduce what is happening when our body is exposed to high temperatures. So there is like, as you probably know, I don't know what your background, etc., but as you probably know, there is like in the brain, there is like the hippocamp is like sending a message to the body that the body temperature is getting too high. So there will be a set of mechanisms that will start to take place to try to cool down the body temperature. And the main mechanism through which our body can cool down its temperature is through evapotranspiration, to just evacuating water outside of the body. And this process is the most effective process through which like our body is going to just try to cool down. So evapotranspiration is done through radiation, but also mostly through sweating. And you will see we're going to go back to that when we're going to talk about humidity and why humidity is a big issue in relation to extreme heat, because of course you can guess that when absolute humidity levels are particularly high, like evapotranspiration won't be as effective as it could be in a dry area. So we're going to go back to that. But this is just like as a place to start. So where our body is exposed to extreme heat, we will have this kind of sequence of processes that aim at cooling down the body temperature. So to do that, we're going to have vasodilatation, which is just like a physical process, just to send as much blood as possible towards the skin, just to send, like evacuate, and just have as much exchange between the blood and the skin to evacuate as much water as possible. So that has two consequences. First of all, that will just like lead to a very high activity of the cardiovascular system, because you need just to accelerate your circulation to just like have as much exchange between your blood and the skin. So the first process, and of course you will lose a lot of water, and that's the idea. The main reason for which we sweat is just to evacuate like hot temperature, so just to cool down. So if we don't drink enough, and Did it stop recording? Wait, started again.
I think that might have been me.
Okay. Can you?
I don't know if it was you or me. I think my Zoom crashed and restarted. So
Okay. Can you
host?
can you hear me, everybody?
Yeah, I can.
Still? Can you see the slides? Okay. Okay. Cool.
All right.
Just in case.
Continue
Okay.
on.
Where was I? Yeah, I was okay. So we have this process. So we have like a cascade of events that's going to happen. So again, the idea is so the cardiovascular system is maybe won't stop until the body temperature cools down. So of course, you can see that people that may have some issues, cardiovascular issues, are going to be extremely vulnerable, because if your cardiovascular system starts to just like go like above the ceiling, you may easily lead to a myocardial infarction, for example, or just a cardiac arrest. So that's the first risk. And this is why when you look at numbers, the main, the driving cause of hospital admission, emergency department visit, or premature death in relation to extreme heat is cardiovascular health. It's CVD, cardiovascular diseases, because people that have existing cardiovascular diseases are extremely susceptible, extremely vulnerable to the impact of extreme heat because of that, because it's very easy for the cardiovascular system to be overwhelmed, to be just overwhelmed when our body is trying to cool down. And again, there is no limit. The body won't stop just like sending as much blood as possible to the skin to evaporate, to evapotranspirate, until the body temperature reduces. So you can see why this is the main driver of heat-related deaths, especially among people that have a cardiovascular system. Of course, all of us, and a heat stroke among like outdoor workers, for example, is typically a cardiac arrest. This is most of the time what is happening, because it doesn't stop. And of course, there is a limit, whatever the age of the victim. Okay, so this is the first big kind of component, just like the exacerbation of the cardiovascular system. And of course, today I'm just talking about the kind of the short-term acute impacts, because of course, even if heat doesn't kill you, but you may be exposed to this kind of extreme heat event like frequently, which is the case, you can see why it may have like long-term and chronic impacts. So if you're repeatedly exposed to extreme heat, you may see why it may weaken your cardiovascular system and other vital functions. But this is another topic. Today, I'm just really talking about this kind of acute short-term mechanisms, okay? So that's the first component, the cardiovascular system overwhelming. Then another thing that is happening, because again, the main reason for which we send so much blood in our system to have as much exchange with the skin is just to evacuate water through sweating, because this is the most efficient way to just like evacuate hot temperatures. And of course, what is going to happen? There will be dehydration, because by doing that, we lose water in our body. And that is going to be particularly problematic for people that have like metabolic disorders, including like issues with kidney function or with the renal function. And you can see why. If you start being dehydrated, suffer from dehydration, you may easily lead to a kidney failure. And that is the second type of issue that could be a problem. But there is another thing that I would like to talk about, and that's very, very important to understand why heat is a bigger deal than what we initially thought like a few years ago, is that there is like a new documented mechanism through what we call the increase of the gut permeability. So this kind of dehydration mechanism that is happening. And because this kind of evacuation of water, again, this is assuming you stay in a hot temperature and you don't drink enough water to compensate for that. So you will have a reduction of the gut permeability because of this lack of water. And that is going to lead to like exchanges between what is inside the gut and what is in the circulation system. And that is a big problem. And two issues are at least, or three issues at least, are associated with that. You have some components, and including bacteria and viruses, that will start interacting with the circulation system that have nothing to do with in a circulation system that's supposed to stay in the gut. But because of this increase in the gut permeability, you will start observing this type of exchange between what is inside the gut and the circulation system. So it may lead to a sepsis, to a very high infection, a blood infection, which can be a big, big deal. Also, more chronically, more systematically, it may lead to a systemic inflammation. That could be also an issue. But also you can have some clogs that may start going into the circulation system. And this is one of the main mechanisms that we suspect this is one of the main mechanisms for which we see an increase in a number of strokes during a heat event, because this kind of exchange between the gut and the circulation system with these clogs may lead to this kind of have a clog being stuck in a brain, and this is typically what a stroke is. And of course, as you probably know, a stroke can be it's very deadly if it's not taking like somebody with a stroke not taking in charge in like 15-20 minutes. That can be a very big deal. So this is just like the third kind of component that I want you to emphasize, and this is less obvious than like dehydration or like the impact on the cardiovascular system, because this issue is going to lead to inflammation. And of course, this is also linked to like people living with asthma, for example. So when you have like a very systemic inflammation, people living with asthma may have an asthma exacerbation, and that could be also very problematic, especially if asthma is comorbid with like other metabolic issues like diabetes, etc. And again, this is most of the time you have some communities and some individuals that will have like a lot of comorbidities at the same time, and that could be an issue. So Alec, do you have a question or?
Oh, I was just going to say there was a question in the chat.
Okay, sorry. I don't see. So yeah. Are you saying clocks? Sorry, clocks. I don't. Yeah, I will write it on a chat in a minute. Clocks, but yeah, just like like small, just like a component that have nothing to do, like that have nothing to do within the circulation, in the bloodstream, in the circulation system. Okay, so that was the third component. And of course, beside that, but this is also important, but less critical, just like in general, but you have heat cytotoxicity, because of course, when you expose, your cells are going to be exposed to high temperatures. Cells are going to start dying, just going to start killing themselves, basically. And this is because they're exposed to high temperatures. So this is called heat cytotoxicity. And that could be an issue, but that typically happen like relatively late in a process of being exposed to high temperatures. And another well-documented mechanism, especially among outdoor workers, but also people practicing physical activity during a extreme heat event. I don't even know how to pronounce that correctly, but let's call that rhabdomyolysis, which is basically like the death of a muscle, of the fibers within a muscle because of like a cytotoxicity. And that actually could be an issue, because what this muscle dying is going to release in the bloodstream can be extremely toxic and can lead to sepsis and inflammation, as just in the same way as increasing the gut permeability. So that is something that can be deadly as well. So this is like just a comprehensive overview about what is happening to our body when we're exposed to high temperatures and when we don't do anything, and when you just keep being exposed to that. And you can see that we're not all with the same level of risk. So people with existing comorbidities are extremely sensitive. And when I'm talking, for example, about an exacerbation of the cardiovascular system, it can be like someone can be impacted within like 15 minutes or 1 hour. It can be relatively quick. You don't need to stay like 6 hours in the sun or something like that to be impacted. It can be very quick. And same thing about the gut permeability and the kidney failure. That can take place very quickly. So especially if you already have a vulnerability, a metabolic disorder like diabetes, for example, that can be a big deal. So this is just a relatively short version of just explaining why at the end of the day, heat is very sneaky. Because of how body reacts to hot temperatures, it leads to a lot of specific complication. And this is at the end of the day, why we see this huge number of deaths that are actually attributable to heat, which means, when I'm saying that, it means that if there was no heat wave, these individuals would not die, even if they have been listed to die from a cardiovascular diseases. This cardiovascular, like let's say a myocardial infarction, this myocardial infarction, MI, would not have happened without the extreme heat event. So this huge number are driven by these very complex and sneaky mechanisms. Okay, so in total, we usually say that there are 7 vital organs that are critically impacted by extreme heat. and are listed here. And this is here just like a schematic, if you want to use that. This is just a summary of what I just discussed, but in a schematic, just explaining the main mechanisms through which heat is going to be impactful, including the dehydration, the cardiovascular system, and everything that is going to be a little bit more like later in the process, like heat cytotoxicity and death of the muscle fibers. But here, this is also just a table summarizing how the 7 vital organs that are typically impacted by heat can be impacted through different types of mechanism, including rhabdomyolysis, like the death of muscle fibers, but also ischemia, lack of blood in some vital organs, and or heat cytotoxicity or an inflammatory response. So this is just a quick summary of just like what is happening when a body is exposed to extreme heat. And this is why heat is a huge silent killer. So that closes the first section of this kind of activity. So do you have any comment or question? But my goal was really to explain you why heat is such a big killer and such a silent and sneaky killer. So I hope I convinced you that this is a big deal and why this is hard to actually quantify the true burden of extreme heat. But this is also, I think, a big issue because in the context of climate change, all of these numbers are just going to keep just like rising. And again, and I will go back to that in a few slides, this is not random. Some communities and some individuals are going to be particularly impacted by that. So yeah, any question, any comment? No? Shall we go to the second phase? Okay. Okay, so now, and that's easy because it was in an abstract that you received. So this is also a way to check if you read the abstract. So the second activity is really to talk about specifically the role of humidity. And the reason for which I would like to emphasize the role of humidity is really because, especially in California, this is what climate change is doing. So we always see climate change as a context because climate change, probably I should have started by that, but you probably know climate change is just like changing climate being the statistics of weather observations. So when we talk about climate, this is just a statistical distribution of some meteorological variables like temperature. So when we talked about climate, this is, for example, can be described by the mean of a distribution, the standard deviation in a distribution can be by the extremes, by whatever. So climate is a statistical concept in a specific place. For example, San Diego has a specific climate, and we can describe the climate of San Diego by describing the range of precipitation, the seasonality of precipitation, etc., etc. So when we talk about climate change, this is really a change in a statistical distribution of weather observations. So what is happening in the context of climate change is that, of course, we see an increase in temperatures because of many very relatively obvious mechanisms, kind of the greenhouse effect. But on top of that, because of the increase in just like an increase in the temperature of the ocean, we have an increase in what we call atmospheric moisture. And that is going to lead, especially in coastal areas, an increase in more humidity, because humidity is just another word for atmospheric moisture. And this is what we observe more and more in California, is that in the context of climate change, we see what we call a change in the flavors, in the types of extreme heat events. So instead of having typically dry extreme heat events, it's very high temperatures that will take place at a given time of the year, we see more and more like humid heat waves or heat events. And this is particularly problematic. And what we expect is that in the next 30 to 50 years, most of the extreme heat events are going to be driven by humidity. And that's a big issue because this is relatively rare to date. You probably expect, I assume everybody is in San Diego right now, having a humidity wave is relatively rare. In 30 or 50 years from now, this will be the norm. Most of the heat waves will be humid, like when you go to North Carolina, for example, which is not pleasant. I mean, during the summer. So no, the question is, there are at least 3 reasons for which humidity is going to be like a problem in relation to public health impacts. So there are 3 reasons. So what can you say?
I almost feel like you need to rewind it and like say, wait a second, California's going to be more like South Carolina. Is that what I heard?
Yeah, in terms of humidity, yeah.
Okay.
But South Carolina or North Carolina, Florida
All
would
right,
be
I need
even
to sit
worse
with
by then.
that, with my my idea of like dry heat in California, because that's kind of terrifying for me in a lot of respects. So I wonder if we could do this in maybe like a waterfall, kind of chat. And a waterfall chat is you type your response, and then everyone will hit enter at the same time. And the prompt is this question of like, what are the different reasons why it's an issue that we might have much greater humidity with our extreme, or with heat waves and extreme heat events, specifically in California. So I'm going to give you exactly 1 minute to type all the ideas that you have for like reasons why that could be a problematic for public health. And then I'll say go at the end of the minute, and then we'll all hit enter and submit. So time to think and type. 1 minute. Type, but don't hit enter yet.
Thank you, Ole.
I'm sorry, we're answering why there's going to be increased atmospheric moisture, or the reasons?
Why
No,
it's going to be a problem to
Yeah.
have it.
Oh,
Yeah, it's happening.
sorry, wrong question.
Yeah. So it's why is it a problem for public health in California?
All right, we're at our minute. I'm going to say go on 3. And when I say 3, go ahead and type it. 1, 2, 3, go.
Come on.
All right,
Beyond.
3. Now you got a bunch of responses.
Yeah.
And that'll give you an idea of what everyone's thinking in terms of what the factors are. By the way, they didn't get an abstract ahead of time.
Okay. I saw. Okay, I saw.
Just as FYI.
Okay. Sorry about that, because I think I sent an abstract, right? But I remember writing that.
I do have one. We changed the structure a little bit. So
Okay.
sorry, I didn't communicate that ahead of time.
Oh, interesting response about the vector-borne diseases. That's interesting. We can talk about that at the end, which is a very interesting topic, especially for like San Diego, where we see more and more. You probably notice that, like this type of daytime mosquitoes, Aedes aegypti, who are transmitting dengue. This is coming. That's not good news, but that's another thing. But yeah, we can discuss about that later. And yeah, actually, but I think, yeah, the physiological mechanism is definitely a good one. So let's say the mosquito like this is very interesting. This is not something I plan to discuss, but we definitely can talk about that, about this kind of compounding impacts between extreme heat and other issues, including vector-borne diseases. And but we can discuss about that at the end if we have time. But yeah, but most of you, I think, like identified the first reason that, let me see, yeah. Actually, that's the second reason. Let's go back to the warmer nights later. But when you have a high level of humidity, and again, when I say humidity, but that's a technical conversation, but this is just to be as precise and specific as possible. I'm talking about absolute humidity, the level of moisture in the air, because most of the time when you read, like on your phone, the weather, they will give you the relative humidity in percentage. But this is a moving target. The relative humidity is a metric that is proportional to the temperature. So you can so this is a little bit difficult to interpret. It's easy on a day-to-day basis, but here when I'm talking about humidity, what matters for physiological processes is really the absolute level of humidity, not the relative one. So just a side note, just to be very, very specific. But yeah, so when there is a lot of humidity in the air, because the main physiological processes that we discussed before, so evapotranspiration, is not going to be super efficient, because the difference in terms of between outside and inside the body, in terms of water concentration and moisture levels, is not going to be is going to be reduced. So the process is not going to be as efficient as possible. So which means that the rate at which our body is going to cool down is not going to be the same, which means that it may take way longer to cool down in a humid condition as compared to being in a dry condition. So that's exactly the one reason for which humidity is a problem, because it may alter the physiological processes. And then in the next slide, I will describe specifically what is going on. Just a side note, just to talk about something that is a little bit counterintuitive. You may have seen that in some of the recommendation, and maybe you were just like intrigued about why, because it's very counterintuitive, is that we don't usually recommend elderly people with with a lot of metabolic diseases to use fans, because fans can be very useful for most of us just to cool down. That could be an alternative strategy to air conditioning. But if your metabolic system and you already have your physiological mechanism is not super efficient, when you're going to be exposed to a fan, it's going to dry your skin up and going to eliminate most of the water and prevent the body to cool down as efficiently as it will be without this kind of fan processes. So there is this, at least to me, when I learned that many years ago, I found that super counterintuitive, but it's usually not recommended for the elderly to use a fan to cool down during hot summers, especially when there is a lot of humidity, because it will actually just get rid of the water on the skin before it has an opportunity to cool down the body. So this is something, just a side note, but this is something that you may have been exposed to, or you may see in the future, but now we know why this is, it's recommended like that. Okay, so that was one of the reasons that you all identified, but the first one I identified, and is about what humidity does to just temperatures and how temperature is lasting. Because as you know, as probably noticed, if you've been in North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, or these places on the outside of the country, is that when there is a lot of humidity, temperature are not cooling down as much as they should during the night, as compared to for example, when you go to the desert, you will have, during the night, you can have what we call that the diurnal temperature, the difference between the minimum and the maximum temperature, the daytime and nighttime temperature, we call that the diurnal temperature. So when you have a lot of humidity, this diurnal temperature would be very small, which means that the temperature is not going to be cooling down, which means that people that are exposed, living in, depending on the housing condition, if there is a heat wave and if there is a lot of humidity, there will be this what we interrupted and sustained heat stress. So people are going to be continuously exposed to a lot of heat and continuously exposed to this heat stress and all of the physiological mechanisms that we talked about before. So this is another reason for which humidity is a big issue for public health, because of this kind of sustained and uninterrupted, actually there is a typo. Anyway, I will fix it later. Uninterrupted and sustained heat stress. Okay, so these are the two first reasons. Okay, now before I show you the third reason, just give you an opportunity if you have. Oh, I see on the chat some comments. Sorry. Yeah, we'll talk about the insects and the vector-borne diseases later. Okay, I guess the questions are about that. But just before I show you the third response, do you have any idea, last chance to give an answer about what you think can be an issue, about what can we do about the links between heat and public health? Just a last chance. Okay.
I did give them the slides ahead of time, by the way.
Okay. Okay, so that kills the game.
Yeah, I know.
So one thing to know is that there are a lot of actions, there are a lot of things that are done when there is a heat wave, at least in California and at least in San Diego. And so just very briefly, because that's a big discussion by itself, but we usually, jurisdictions like the county and cities have what we call a heat action plan. So a heat action plan is just like a seasonal set of actions that will take place when a heat wave is going to be activated, going to be triggered by the National Weather Services. So usually when there is a heat wave, preventive activities are going to include early warning systems. So you probably heard that when there is a heat wave, just like on NPR, on the radio, in some like on the TV. So there will be a lot of messages about be careful, there is a heat wave. This is a message for the National Weather Services. Be careful, try to reduce the outdoor physical activity, etc., etc., etc. If you're pregnant, be careful, etc., etc. You probably heard that. So this is based, or this is part of a heat action plan, and this is early warning system, just like to be careful and with preventive messages. But there are a lot of additional actions like opening cooling centers. For example, if you go to downtown, and I will show you a map of the cooling center in San Diego, but so you go to library, there will be air conditioning, and this will be like a sponsored cooling center as part of the driven, like that is kind of managed by the city or by the county. So you have a lot of activities, like for example, in occupational setting, you have you can adapt your working time windows. For example, in the construction, you probably noticed that. I don't know if some of you have some family members working in construction. Of course, you're going to adapt your working hours to the heat wave. So anyway, you have all of these actions that are taking place during a heat wave that are part of a heat action plan. The problem is that all of these actions and everything that we do nowadays and everything that we know and all of the evidence we know about what works and what doesn't work to try to prevent heat-related illnesses is based on daytime activities. We have absolutely no idea about what to do during the night when we will have more and more this heat, except like providing access to air conditioning to everybody, which is not a superb, sustainable idea just to provide air conditioning to everybody. Air conditioning is compulsory. We have to rely on air conditioning, but it has to be done with parsimony to target specific individuals and specific communities that could not do otherwise. But in general, we can't just rely on just on air conditioning, because that's just going to be an endless kind of loophole. But this is the third reason for which humidity is going to be a big problem for public health, because we don't know what to do any prevention during nighttime, and that's a big issue. We really have no idea. So that's I'm saying that just like we have like some few decades to figure that out, but this is a big issue. We really don't know what to do. So this is just like why humidity is a big issue, and that's particularly problematic in coastal California, because this is what climate change is going to do to the flavor, the type of extreme heat events that's going to take place. Okay. So then the next slide, just like a little bit more details about, oh, sorry, there is a question. Oh, I will talk about that later, because there are solutions, of course, besides having access to air conditioning, and that would be like structural changes about the type of housing and the type of landscape and urban landscape. And we're going to talk about reducing what we call micro-heat islands, and I'm going to talk about that later. So it's like a kind of, but yeah, this is very important, because what we can do at the end of the day is really to try to structurally change our cities and adapt our cities to this type of new reality and new environment and new conditions. So this is just like a slide that you can use if you need to explain the mechanisms to which humidity or the physiological processes to cool down a body temperature are going to be altered because of humidity. But it's really what we discussed before and what you identified on your response on the chart. But it's really about that, just like a lack of, just like the reduction of the contrast between inside and outside, inside and outside the body in terms of level of moisture, and that will just reduce the efficiency of this evapotranspiration. And another thing to know is that above 35 degrees Celsius, which is like 97, I think, Fahrenheit, evapotranspiration is the only way through which our body temperature can be reduced through sweating, because below 35 degrees, you have different types of processes like convection and radiation that can be also useful, but are not as efficient as evapotranspiration. But at 35 degrees, this is a body limit, this is a physiological limit, and only evapotranspiration is going to make a difference. So of course, when you have a lot of humidity, this is just going to be very, very difficult for our body to cool down in such conditions. So this is just like a little bit more details. And in all of the references that I listed below, all of these things are explained and described if you need or if you're interested to get into the details. So now I think we're ready to go to the third activity, but which will be the last activity. And I just want to make sure that you have, if you have any questions also.
Oh, and Tarik, just as a heads up, we're running a little short on time. So
Okay.
The next question we don't have to respond to, because I want to give time for participants to interact with one another in a breakout room for at least the last 20 minutes of
Okay.
meeting.
So let me just go through the answer directly then. And before, so as we won't have too much time, before I get into this map and explaining what is behind this map, just like a side note, because it was raised in a chat. So just for those who don't know, so like someone like raised this issue of mosquitoes. So there are the specific type of infectious diseases that we call vector-borne diseases that are most of the time viruses that will be like transported by vectors. So it could be rodents, could be birds, could be, and most of the time this is driven by mosquitoes. So the most kind of like common vector-borne diseases are malaria, which are transmitted, which is a parasite. It's not a virus, but it is a parasite that is transmitted by what we call a type of mosquito that is Anopheles. But, and this is problematic for San Diego, we have different types of vector-borne diseases, and the main one is there is West Nile virus, which is a big issue, but what is increasing is dengue. And dengue is a virus that is transmitted on one specific type of mosquito that is typically called Aedes aegypti. It's a relatively big mosquito that just needs a little bit of water and hot condition to thrive and just to breed. So you probably saw that in some of the I saw that like in the last few days, like some specific public health recommendation about getting rid of your small amount of water in your garden, if you have a garden or something like that, because if you have like a small cup or something like that with like standing water, that would be the perfect environment for mosquito to breed. And so these mosquito are very special because they're daytime mosquitoes. So as opposed to Anopheles, they're going to be active during the day. So they're going to impact and infect a lot of people. And of course, the symptoms associated with the dengue fever are very, very difficult to distinguish from a heat stroke, for example, or heat-related illness. And of course, if you have both, if someone is exposed to dengue and there is a heat event, that is not a good combo to do. So of course, I appreciate the fact that someone raised that, because this is a very important question, this issue of compounding impact between like climate sensitive exposure, like extreme heat, and infectious diseases, and especially vector-borne diseases. So anyway, that was just a side note. I think this is an important topic. So now just to wrap up in 3 minutes or 5, this map. So this map is a San Diego County, as you probably recognize. And this is for each zip code, this is a number of people that are hospitalized or admitted to the emergency department because of extreme heat. So we calculated for each zip code is a burden attributable to extreme heat, one specific type of extreme heat condition. So for each zip code, we took the distribution in the last 30 years, and we calculated just like any day above the 95th percentile of maximum temperature has been considered as an extreme heat event, just for the case study, just for the example. But here we can see that this number for 100 heat wave days for a specific zip code, you can see that you have some zip code in which the number of people being affected is basically 0 or very, very small. But you have other zip codes in which this number can be huge, can go up to 100. So when we talk about 100 hospitalization, so this is one hospitalization for each heat wave days, which means that in a given zip code, which is relatively small, each time, on average, of course, each time you have a heat wave, somebody is going to be impacted and go to the emergency department, which is a big deal. So this is just like to show this huge heterogeneity between zip codes in San Diego. So now the initial question, what is driving that? And one way to think about what is driving this kind of spatial heterogeneity in how communities that are impacted by extreme heat is to think about with these two components that in environmental justice literature, we call the environmental justice double jeopardy. So first, this is like the first mechanism is differential susceptibility. So the prevalence of people with pre-existing chronic conditions, the type of occupational activity and exposure to heat stress through outdoor working, and other types of environmental justice metrics, like the type of housing and or the type of access to healthcare and so on, are going to drive this spatial heterogeneity. So of course, a community, a zip code in which a prevalence of people living with diabetes are definitively going to be explaining why some communities are going to be highly impacted by extreme heat. So this is the first mechanism. Again, I'm just like, this is a big picture just to explain that, because there are many like kind of subtleties, but this is just to give you the big picture. And the second mechanism is what we call differential exposure, because even when there is a specific extreme heat event, even within like downtown San Diego, for example, there will be a lot of variability in what people are actually exposed to. So that could be in terms of where they live. So for example, even within a condo or even a building, different condos that will be just under the roof won't have the same temperature as a condo that will be just on the ground, for example. And one important component that we discussed, and I would like to emphasize today, is really about the landscape, and how the landscape is driving the spatial distribution of what we call microheat island, because the distribution of green spaces, trees, and impervious surfaces is going to explain a lot of variability in what individuals and community are actually experiencing in terms of temperature. So you can have National Weather Services that is saying that today in San Diego is 95 degrees Fahrenheit, but this is not what some individuals can experience in where they live. And it has been estimated that in a given place, for example, in New York City, on the same day with exactly same kind of atmospheric condition in terms of heat, you can see a difference up to 10 degrees because of the landscape, because of the spatial distribution of trees and impervious surfaces. So this is huge. Just you can go between just like 30 degrees and 40 degrees just because of the type of neighborhood in which you live. So this is another reason for which we see so much variability. So this is just San Diego, but we do that everywhere, and we will see a lot of heterogeneity. So there is a lot of inequalities. When you think about the burden attributable to heat, this is not random. It's systematically impacted communities that are going to accumulate a lot of microheat islands, but also a lot of like communities with lack of access to healthcare, different type of job conditions, and pre-existing conditions that will make these individuals particularly susceptible and vulnerable to the impact of extreme heat because of all of the reasons we talked about before. So let me skip that. This is a conceptual framework that we use a lot in public health. We call that the social determinants of health. So this is just useful as a framework to think about how different determinants are going to multi-level determinants are going to interact to explain why we observe health inequalities. And when we talk about health inequalities, this is the case for absolutely everything. So this is just like a framework that we use a lot. And here, this is just an interesting schematic that I don't have time to go through, but it's just to explain the different, like some of the mechanisms to which we can explain race ethnic disparities in heat-related health effects, especially in the context of the US. And here you can see that this is everything we talked about here in terms of pre-existing conditions or contextual social conditions in terms of level of crime and safety and the social isolation, the type of housing characteristics, etc., are going to ultimately explain why we have so much heterogeneity in the burden attributable to extreme heat. So this is just other examples that we don't have to go through. This is just a specific case study that I wanted to emphasize about unhoused individuals experiencing homelessness, which, as you know, is a very, very big issue in the US and especially in California and especially in San Diego. And here we show that how individuals experiencing homelessness in San Diego were like particularly at risk. And just to give you a number, just to give you the order of magnitude about how big deal it is, in San Diego, we estimate that the proportion of people reporting being unhoused is 0.3, 0.4% of the total population of the county. Do you know, or can you guess, what is the proportion of people that have been admitted to the emergency department that is reporting directly being unhoused? Do you have an idea? Just an order of magnitude. This is 15%. So the unhoused individuals in San Diego represent 0.3, 0.4% of the population, but they represent up to 15% of all of the hospital admissions. This is huge. So, and this number is exploding when there is an extreme heat event or when there is a wildfire smoke event. So this, I just wanted to emphasize that this is a very, very, very big environmental justice issue. And I think this is particularly important in San Diego. Anyway, side note. So this is just like for information, the spatial distribution of cooling zones in San Diego. So you can see where they are. And most of the times are libraries or public spaces, community centers, etc., that have access to air conditioning. So this is a place that people can visit to cool down during the day. I can skip that. I just also wanted to emphasize structural racism drivers of why we see today in San Diego some spatial inequalities in a tree canopy coverage. And just to link that with historical reason, I don't know if you're familiar with this concept of redlining and this kind of practices from the last century that basically drove the segregation of nowadays. And this is just one example, and you name it. There's so many examples. And if you look at these maps from the 30s, like 1 century ago, and you look today at the spatial distribution of tree canopies, the spatial distribution of asthma rates, the spatial distribution of air pollution, the spatial distribution of industrial sites, etc., there will be a very, very good correlation, and this is not just a coincidence. So this is also something that I wanted to emphasize. This is just examples about what can be done to increase greening in San Diego, and I will stop there. So we have time for questions. So how am I on time? 35, so not that bad.
Yeah, so there are questions for Tarik, and then what we'll do is we're going to move into breakout rooms. And in the breakout rooms, what we'll have is an opportunity to talk about connections to what we teach and how we might engage students with some of the content that we learned about in the phenomena of health and humidity. So I'm going to open it up to everyone to ask questions. You can put it in the chat, or you can come off your mute and share your question. I see Gina has a question with her hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I just was wondering, what do you think? I mean, because we just don't see changes in people's choices and lifestyles and things like that. It doesn't seem like they're perceiving that either they can have an impact or they think it's as imminent of an issue, like we have to deal with this. What do you think is the best way to disseminate not just disseminate information to the public, but really like increase public awareness? I mean, like we've done several successful campaigns in California, like the anti-smoking campaign, but climate change, it seems like we just aren't seeing changes in people. So what would you say would be a better public service campaign?
So you're talking about mitigation efforts, try to reduce emissions and try to reduce climate change in the next decades, right? Or are you talking specifically about heat?
Well, specifically specifically related to climate change as it would impact heat, but like what could we do to have people make changes in their life that are necessary?
Oh, that's a kind of that's also like the big issue in public health, because there is like this is well documented in public health, and smoking is a very good example. And how this concept, what I briefly introduced, this concept of social determinant of health is extremely important. And I will take smoking as an example because I think it will be obvious to most. But when you think about smoking, you just like, if you want to reduce the prevalence of smoking, it's everything but enough to tell people that smoking is dangerous. We know that for decades. So this level of individual information and education is everything but enough. And this is what is achieved by campaigns and public information. So when you think about this level of action, this is just a very small contribution, like a small component of action that we can do to structurally try to reduce smoking prevalence. If you want to just like to act more structurally, and this is what has been done in California, you can act on social norms just to make smoking very shameful. And this is that was a strategy in California in the last decade. California is unique as compared to New York and other jurisdictions because they really emphasized the social norms around smoking. But you can also increase the price of smoking. You can also reduce the density of smoking retails, etc. So you can think of different levels of intervention that structurally are going to influence population level behaviors. And for climate change, this is the same thing at the end of the day. You can't just assumes that by educating people individually and telling them how like reducing emission of greenhouse gases today by individual behavior, such as eating less meat or biking to work, etc., that is not going to be enough, because you really need to think about structural change here. But that is about mitigation in general. And that is, again, I'm going a little bit off just like on the side, but this is also this in a very interesting conversation. There are a lot of very interesting reading about just like the strategies of the lobbies against like just like climate action, or or in favor of not doing anything just for specific types of industries. So as you probably know, there is like a lot of just documentation about how the lobbyists that used to work for the tobacco industry switched to work for the just like the oil companies and different types of industries that significantly contributed to climate change. And it's interesting to analyze the discourse and the strategies that have been used, because if you look at the 2 or 3 last decades, there are just like a sequence of arguments that have been used, starting by, oh, climate change is not a thing. We don't have any climate change. Then, okay, the next like set of kind of arguments were about, oh, no, climate change is not due to human activity. This is a natural process. This is just like a natural variability. So then they switch to, there are a lot of positive aspects of climate change, etc. And now in the last decade, most of the strategy for this lobbying company are really to try to focus, to switch all of the conversation to individual actions, to see, oh, you can make a difference. You can make a difference by, I don't know, like when you take a flight tickets, you can buy whatever to plant a tree, whatever, you don't even show, etc. Just like culpabilizing people by their individual behaviors. And that's a very efficient strategy to just like not discuss about the structural changes that are actually necessary to make a huge difference in terms of emission of greenhouse gases. So that works for mitigation, that works for smoking, that works for physical activity, that works for air pollution, that works for extreme heat. This is the same. Sorry, that was a long answer, but I think this is just about why it is important to think structurally, and this is exactly what it is about in public health, just to try to think structurally.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Tarik?
Is it all right if I ask a question? I'm new to this group.
Oh, go ahead.
So I'm thinking about your early slide where you contrasted the CDC estimate of 658 people per year with a more recent epidemiological estimate of 12 to 20,000. And I believe you used the words that complex epidemiological methods were needed. I don't want to throw all of us too much in the weeds, but I'm just curious what those methods are. And forgive me if you said that.
Oh, no, I didn't describe that. But so again, I could go for a long response for that. But so the idea is that it's really like, and this is what we do in epidemiology, is to really try to answer causal question and like that are counterfactual by nature. And this is the framework we use. So we try to ask the following question. So there was a heat wave. So there was, during this specific heat wave in this specific zip code, we observed that many hospital admission. So what we're trying to do is, if in the absence of this heat wave event, how many people shall we expect to see going to the hospital? And this is what all of the game that we're trying to do, is to estimate this counterfactual quantity. And we're trying to say, okay, so what is the best estimate we can get in terms of what is typically expected in this specific time of the day? So there are different types of approaches to deal with that, but just to give you intuitively one way to deal with that, there is a specific type of design that we use that is called a time stratified case crossover. So very intuitively. So the idea is that let's say today, when in San Diego, we're October 24th, there will be a heat wave, and I will go to the hospital for whatever reason, for myocardial infarction, for stroke. So, and there is a heat wave today. So we are Tuesday. We are Tuesday. So our Tuesday in October. So what I will do, I will try to take I'm a case on a specific Tuesday, probably the third Tuesday of October. So what I will do, I will try to see if on the other Tuesday of the month, in October 2023, we see a difference in the number of people that have been exposed. Because I know I've not been admitted to the hospital in other Tuesdays of the month of October of 2023. I've been admitted in this specific Tuesday in this specific month of 2023, and there was a heat wave, hypothetically. So the idea, I'm going to use that, but I'm going to use that for thousands and thousands of cases, and then I'm going to use a specific type of statistical model to try to see. So do we see, is it a coincidence that we see all of this myocardial infarction admission during a heat wave, and when we compare that to the same day of the week, of the same months of the year, etc.? Or is it just like, is it like a random, is it due to random variability, or is it actually just like a specific pattern? And then we're going to use specific statistical analysis to try to disentangle what is happening randomly and normally, seasonally, to what is happening because of the heat wave. So this is in a nutshell, just like the type of approaches that we do. But that's, yeah, that's could be a way longer answer.
And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share a link to the Jamboard that we've created. And that Jamboard has 3 key questions. And the 3 key questions are, we can respond to them in any order. You can go in any order you would like. And the first question, once you access that Jamboard, is how might you engage students with what you learned in Tarik's research presentation? So you have access to a slide deck. There's also this wonderful other question that's on another page of the Jamboard, which is, what additional information or resources might you want from Tarik and possibly the San Diego Science Project to engage students? And then there's the second question, which is, where do you see connections to your curriculum with what Tarik was sharing? We were talking earlier when Darcy logged in a little bit earlier, talking about connections to anatomy and physiology. So I'm going to give you some time to respond to those prompts, and then we're just going to stay in one room here, and you can add your own sticky notes and say them out loud as you add them. And if you need help learning how to use the Jamboard, there's a little link on the left that says sticky note, and if you click on that, you can start typing a sticky note in any of the boards. And the way you can move around is at the top. There's some arrows for the questions.